This meeting is being live streamed. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am super excited to find out what Caitlin Hibma has found out with her thesis, dissertation, and it's about the Monterey Colonial style and how it represents the marrying of two different cultures, Mexican and American, and representing the important socioeconomic and cultural themes of the day. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to the architectural historian and preservationist who's visiting with us from San Francisco today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm actually in Richmond, which is it's a little outside of San Francisco, but Bay Area. And I'm happy to be Zooming in with you. My name is Caitlin, and I am an architectural historian and historic resources consultant here in the Bay Area, which means that I work with property owners, architects, real estate developers, and city governments to assess historic properties and make sure that they're being treated appropriately when there are projects that happen. But I actually grew up in Southern California in Irvine, and I am familiar with Rancho Los Cerritos, having been there many years ago. But I remember that it was lovely, and maybe I will get back someday soon. I have an undergrad degree in art history and a grad degree in historic preservation from the University of Oregon, which is where this whole Monterey Colonial theme comes from, when I did my thesis almost 20 years ago. But I really enjoyed this opportunity to reread my thesis and get familiar with the topic again. And it was just as interesting as it was 20 years ago. So I am excited to share it with you. I'm hoping that although the topic and the talk tonight focuses mostly on the city of Monterey, that you'll be able to pull some threads out that apply to your own Monterey Colonial adobe down there in Long Beach. I'm going to start my screen share, and then I have kind of a PowerPoint here for you, so we can look at some beautiful pictures. All right, hoping you can see that. That's my opening slide. So I'll start with just a quick kind of overview of the historic context of all this, because I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with how things went down in California in the early days. The first Europeans obviously landed in 1542 near San Diego and spread northward with their mission to establish presidios, Catholic missions, and small Pueblo communities. And those also demonstrated some architectural interest. I guess you would call it Spanish colonial architecture. It used local materials like adobe brick and timber and clay tile to build what were very staunch and simple and defensive bits of architecture. The mission for the Spanish was primarily military and religious indoctrination. So there was often friction in the land, and so they had to be very defensive in setting up thick-walled structures with small openings, things like that you would see in defensive architecture. In 1821, Mexico declared independence from Spain, and life in California obviously became much more secular. It became less about subsistence and more about culture and commerce. And the architecture stayed much the same in terms of its kind of simple and appearance with adobe and clay tile and things like that. But it started to focus more on residential architectural types that, they were bringing settlers in and establishing ranchos and places where people were living. So the typical, I'm going to call it the typical Mexican or the traditional Mexican adobe that I'm going to refer to throughout this was really a one-story long, low structure. It might be one rooms, it might be multiple rooms. They would be arranged in a line, literally, and connected via an exterior porch, like you see here, with each room having a door off onto the porch. They usually had a thatch roof early on or a clay tile roof later on. And rooms were multi-purpose. They could use for many purposes, with a kitchen usually separate from the main house. And there might be an exterior stair that led to a sleeping porch that would, or a sleeping attic that would be up under the roof line of the house. So that's what you would find in Mexican California. In 1846, Mexico came under Californian control. I thought I missed a slide here, maybe not. And Monterey was the first capital of California. And in the brief moment before 1846 is kind of the time period I'm focusing on here with the Monterey Colonial style. It was a time that Thomas Oliver Larkin, he was not Irish, called the Halcyon Days. And they were a time when the prevailing culture, traditions, politics, and religion were Mexican, but the upper echelons of Monterey society were full of wealthy American merchants who were very successful. They had a lot of political clout and social status, and they brought American goods and culture into the Mexican community. And that was in a short period from about 1830 to 1846, in a time that was a big melting pot in Monterey. So to talk a little bit more about Mr. Larkin here, he was the most prominent American merchant in Monterey for many years. He arrived in California in 1832. He opened a shop in his house here. This is the Larkin house that I'll talk about more later. It was basically a dry goods shop. He had a grog shop in his garden, which was basically a bar where they sold liquor. He also had a bowling alley that he ran. And he took great interest in customs and trade regulations in Monterey. He acted as a bank for American citizens that were in the area. And eventually he was appointed the first and only consul of the United States and a confidential agent for the government, keeping an eye on all the other nationalities that were operating in California at the time. He came to deeply appreciate the Mexican culture that he lived in, but he also remained very aloof, and that will be reflected in the architectural style that he devises. So Thomas Larkin was brought up near Boston, Massachusetts, and that would have made him very familiar with the house styles that you see there, like those in the upper left here. Very colonial revival, very symmetrical facades, classical ornament, red brick, and hipped roofs, dormers, things like that. In 1821, he moved to the South, where he did business, including some real estate development and lumber milling in both Wilmington, North Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina. And I think while he was there, he couldn't have failed to have noticed architecture and these two-story, they call them piazzas, and they're made with beautiful cast iron or wrought iron. A little more fancy than what you see in Monterey, but obviously maybe a derivation there. And I'm going to say that the verandas that we see in the Monterey Colonial style may have also had some Spanish precedent. The law of the Indies that was passed in 1573 by the Spanish government dictated town planning in Spanish colonies. And it required all buildings on a main square or on a town square or a main street to have an arcade that provided shade and shelter for the public benefit. And often in the construction, those ended up being kind of two-story veranda-like structures. So those also are evocative of the Monterey Colonial verandas. And Larkin would definitely have encountered architecture like that passing through the Caribbean and other Spanish territories on his way to California. When he eventually arrived in California, in Monterey, he stayed with his brother, John Rogers Cooper, who was already established in Monterey. And the Coopers lived in a traditional style, one-story Mexican adobe. So in coming to California, Larkin first lived in a traditional Mexican adobe, and he, I think all the architectural styles started gelling, so that when he eventually built his own house, he had a lot of different things to mix into it. Here I'll talk a little bit about the actual characteristics of the style. I described the defensive Presidio and mission styles of the Spanish period and the traditional adobe residences of the Mexican period. And the Monterey Colonial style obviously took those and kind of wrapped them into itself, using materials that were native to the California environment and mixing them with construction techniques, forms and floor plans, and finishing details too, that were influenced by the architecture of other places, specifically the East Coast of America. At the most basic, Monterey Colonial style buildings are 2 stories with a signature 2-story veranda that wraps at least one facade, often 2 or 3. And they're built of an internal timber frame, which you see illustrated here, as joists for floors and ceilings. And also on the right here, you see a vertical post that's often kind of a signature element in the corners of rooms. So they had these internal frames that held up the 2-story structure. They were often capped by red clay tile roofs in a hipped form, like you saw back east. So it's important to note too that milled lumber was not available in Monterey prior to 1844. And that's when Thomas Larkin himself established a mill up near Santa Cruz. And so milled lumber became available at that point, but even then it had to be hauled down from Santa Cruz. So it was not readily available. And skilled carpenters were also in short supply. So really these timber frames kind of cast back to the early colonial architecture of the East Coast, where you see mortise and tenon joinery and wood pegs instead of nails, just very heavy rudimentary building techniques. This is a picture of a detail of an adobe wall in a Monterey Colonial structure, and this has a very pronounced flare at the bottom. But adobe bricks in this style were made, stacked, and mortared as they had been in years previous in the Mexican and Spanish architecture too. But the timber frame allowed these bricks to be stacked up to 2 stories high, which had never been possible before. And the walls tapered as they went up, so that the structure became lighter the higher it went. And it actually, in some cases, allowed for an extra foot or so of space in upstairs rooms. So you had this efficiency of space happening too. And walls like this would not have been able to support things like a second floor or a very heavy roof. So that timber frame, again, partners with the adobe to create a structure that can hold up and be quite tall. The timber frame also helped with seismic stability. So, you always see the warnings about adobe buildings being dangerous in an earthquake, but these have obviously stood up for quite a while. So, that timber frame helps make them more resilient. In Monterey, I don't know if this is true elsewhere, but in Monterey, there's a native stone called chalk rock, and they often use that as a foundation so the moisture wouldn't wick up from the ground into the adobe. This is a detail of the kind of plaster exterior being cut away to show the chalk rock foundation on the bottom and some adobe brick above. Inside the house, floors, which in the traditional Mexican architecture would have been packed earth, were elevated with clay tiles or wood planks, and in a lot of cases were literally elevated in that certain rooms would have a higher floor level to denote their significance, which is kind of interesting. Roofs of Monterey Colonial structures were made of the same timber framework that the building below it was. And they extended out to form very broad eaves, which protected the adobe walls from the weather. Even with the plaster on, rain and driving rain especially was a big problem with melting your adobe. So they wanted to protect them. And Monterey Colonial houses, you'll often see a wood shingle roof as well. That allowed for a lightened load so that the roof could cover greater indoor spaces and have more complex forms. Sometimes you'll see red clay tile, and even then you'll often see wood shingle on the portions over the verandas, because the verandas were more delicate structural elements, and so it reduced the load of the clay tiles because they're quite heavy. And then I will make a small note about the verandas. When I was doing my thesis, I kind of created a typology of these verandas. This is on your left, type 1, where you'll see vertical supports between the first and second stories. The second type in the middle, you'll only see them between the upper balcony and the eaves. And in the third type on the right, everything is cantilevered. And the cantilever actually comes from beamwork that is tied into and part of the floor joists for the second story. So those beams would come all the way out and then support this cantilevered balcony. And the difference in where and when you'll find these often has to do with how early the house was built or how late, but also taste and the various influences that might have come into the architecture just based on the owner's preferences. In the interiors, they liked to, it was the ideal to have your central hall plan, which is a very traditional American floor plan. You'd have this central entry foyer and a stair, a grand stair, hopefully, that led to your upper stories. There was also usually a ballroom, or what the Mexicans would call a sala, and that was an entertaining space, and it was, you know, important to the social customs of both cultures, I think, to have people over to do dancing, etc. So these houses incorporated two cultures in that way. And the second floor rooms, in a very American fashion, were always for private use, bedrooms and private sitting rooms and such. So that's what would have been upstairs. Kitchens, as I noted earlier, in the traditional Mexican adobes, were always kept separate for reasons of fire safety and also heat that was generated. The Monterey Colonial style brought kitchens indoors, and they often tacked them onto the house into a lean-to kind of structure like this, which creates a very salt box form, and that in itself is very New England. This particular photo here is the old whaling station, and it demonstrates windows as well. Those were in a very American convention. In the old Mexican adobes, you'd probably have window openings, but they would be covered with like a wooden grill, and then maybe some oiled hide or something that let light in, but just didn't necessarily allow for view. In California at this time, it was very difficult to get window glass. The older houses you'll see will have smaller panes and wider muntins. And then the more time progressed, they were able to come up with larger panes of glass and more spindly, thin muntins. Glass had to be imported from America, so it was shipped. Of course, it was delicate, it cost a lot. And so in this sense, having windows of a certain type or a certain size of glass kind of denoted your success and your economic prowess. But most Monterey Colonial houses do have windows similar to this. They'd be double hung with multiple lights and often had nice paneled shutters and things to show them off and to protect them. So in my thesis, I kind of distilled all this down into 3 case studies that I felt showed different aspects of the mixture of Mexican and American influences. The first was the Larkin House, which was the prototype. It was built in 1835, and it was the first Monterey Colonial house and one of the best. I already outlined Thomas Larkin's background and how he was an American who came through the Carolinas and traveled to California via the Spanish territories, picking up architectural influence all along the way. I'll also mention that on the ship to California, he met Rachel, whose last name I cannot recall, but she became Rachel Larkin. They married, and she was an American. She was one of the first, or she was the first American woman to settle in California and remained one of the few American women in Monterey, or probably all of California during her time. So she was a little adverse to Mexican society. Thomas kind of integrated more, but on the whole, these two remained very American. They never relinquished their American citizenship. They never converted to Catholicism. They never took Spanish names. Rachel's actually is said to have rejected the Mexican aesthetic enough that when she was ordering her furniture from back east and it hadn't arrived yet, but she was having a party, she actually pulled pumpkins in from the garden to have her guests sit on rather than use the more rudimentary Mexican furniture that was available. So she was perhaps a bit snobbish about her Americanness and the look of her home. And in that sense, their house was probably the most Anglo you will find of the Monterey Colonial houses. She probably had a big part in its furnishing as well as its design. They wanted to create something that evoked the sense of that regal, symmetrical, formal facade you saw in the Colonial Revival house back east, filled with furniture and doodads imported from America. So this house embodied the perfect, it was purpose-built this way, and it embodied the perfect central hall plan with a foyer and stair, a parlor on one side. Thomas Larkin's shop was kind of over on this right side of the building, which is a little out of keeping with the formal house, but he ran his business out of the house. And they had a dining room, they had a kitchen, and they had all their bedrooms upstairs. And they actually hired ship's carpenters when they were on shore leave to come and try and do some fairly ornate spindle work, banisters, moldings, things like that to give their house just a little extra refinement. So stepping into the Larkin house would have been like leaving Mexican California and stepping into New England when you went to visit them. Thomas Larkin was so proud of his house that he had landscapes painted of Monterey so that he could send them back east and share with people what the environs look like. But he always had the Larkin house painted front and center in those paintings so that people would see what he had accomplished. My second case study was Casa Sobranes, which is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the very Anglo Larkin house. This is the Mexican end of the spectrum. Casa Sobranes actually began its life as a traditional one-story Mexican adobe. It was built in 1842 by Don Jose Rafael Estrada, who was a ranking officer at the Monterey Presidio, and he was also a kinsman of Mariana Guadalupe Vallejo, the governor of California. And it's interesting to note that Vallejo played a huge role in proliferating the style, Monterey Colonial style, throughout California. I haven't delved into it too much, but I would like to look at how kinship influenced the spread of the style, especially beyond Monterey, because it seems that many Mexican families, especially, but also some American families, when one member of the family built in the Monterey Colonial style, others would follow. So that's interesting to note. But this house was converted to the Monterey Colonial style around 1850 with the addition of the second story and what is a type 3 veranda, which shows its rather late time period. You also note this is one of the houses with the clay tile roof, but it has the shingles over the veranda to keep the weight off that portion of the structure. To show its origins, it still has that one room deep linear plan of rooms, and the exterior stair to the sleeping attic that would have originally been there was moved inside to one of those end rooms. And if you look at it today, it's very steeply pitched, and it has a strange little curve at the top to get into the upper story, showing how it was retrofitted into that space. The upper story is pretty low ceilinged and cramped, like they couldn't quite envision it not being just a sleeping attic. So the rooms are pretty tight up there. And the back of this house actually has one of those salt box additions, and there's a tiny little hallway that's tucked up under the eaves of that gives access to each of the rooms. So again, rooms weren't interconnecting the way the Mexican adobes would have been, that they were using the American convention of everyone having a private entry to their room. That rear lean-to also has a kitchen on the first floor, so that's where that was incorporated. And again, it gives it that salt box, very New England salt box form. The interior of this house includes a clay tile floor in the sala, but otherwise it has some refined woodworking around the fireplace, but it's otherwise a much more rudimentary and rustic look than you would find in the Larkin house. Casa Sobranes, I should note, was actually named after its second owners, who purchased it in 1860 as a Monterey Colonial style house. And it's also known as the House of the Blue Gate because it has always apparently had a blue gate. But it makes for a very picturesque photo. And my last case study was of the Cooper Molera adobe. You might have heard of this one recently because it was just converted into a fabulous little restaurant and visitor center. So it's a nice centerpiece of Monterey. It's kind of just across the street from the Larkin house, actually. But this house was, well, it illustrates kind of the meeting of the two cultures, the Mexican and the American. It was owned by John Rogers Cooper, who was Thomas Larkin's half-brother. This is the house that Thomas Larkin came to live in when he first arrived in Monterey. So the two had similar East Coast influences growing up. Cooper was actually a ship's captain who went to Asia and traveled the globe before he settled in Monterey. So he had a lot of other influences too, and he was known to be slightly eccentric. But when he came to California, he fully embraced Mexican culture. He married a Mexican woman who happened to be a sister of Mariana Guadalupe Vallejo. So there's another Vallejo connection. He converted to Catholicism. He became a Mexican citizen, and he actually adopted the Hispanicized name of Juan Bautista Rogers Cooper. So he went all in on the Mexican, being part of the Mexican society. Around 1830, he either bought or built a one-story Mexican-style adobe, which would have spanned this entire width that you see here. There was a zaguan, or a carriageway, in between, kind of in the middle, where you see these stairs in this door. And that provided access to a garden at the rear of the house, or a utility yard. At one point, Cooper subdivided the property and sold the right half here to a Mexican family who lived in it and turned a portion of it into a shop. That's why it says dry goods on the side. And they lived in it for quite a while and just maintained it as a one-story Mexican adobe. Meanwhile, Cooper took his half on the left side here and turned it into a Monterey Colonial style house about 15 years after his brother had built the Larkin house. So he obviously had that as an influence. He enlarged the house to subsume the zaguan carriageway, and that allowed him to put a stair hall in the corner of the house here where this door is, with the steps. It wasn't the ideal central hall plan, but it definitely achieved the formal entryway and the stairs to the second story. It was kind of an L-shaped plan originally, and they tucked a kitchen in to create a very traditional four-square plan. And these windows that you see were originally doors, and they closed those up to make windows so that you would not have doorways into your parlor directly off the street, because that would have been gauche in the American way. Also, the interior of this house is furnished with very Victorian style carpeting, wallpaper, and woodwork. So it's very American looking on the inside. They even went to the extent of having a newel post carved and having a mortgage button in it. So tradition, New England tradition, dictated that when you finally paid off the mortgage, you got the deed and you rolled it up and you stuck it in the hollow portion of your newel post, and then you put a button on top of the newel post, set it into the woodwork. And because this is Monterey, they used an abalone shell button. So that was kind of a nice little cast back to the New England traditions. So you'll also see, these are just a few examples of many other Monterey Colonial style buildings throughout the town. And they're not just houses. The Monterey Colonial style is found in the building in the middle here is the Pacific House, and that was originally a hotel and boarding house. In the upper left is the Custom House. That was a government, the Custom House, where all the goods came in off the ships. So it was a government establishment. In the lower right is the old whaling station, which was the headquarters for a whaling operation, and where the sailors would stay when they were in town. And today, a number of former Monterey Colonial houses, like you see in the upper right and lower left, have been converted into modern uses like a restaurant and a hotel. And you'll also see throughout Monterey very referential architecture that is modern. We call it the Monterey Revival style. But it just shows how symbolic the style was of the town and how it was reiterated time and time again in architecture. Revival styles were often most common probably in the 1920s to the 40s, but you see even today, they're building things with these two-story verandas that kind of reference the traditional style of Monterey. So this is your Monterey Colonial and Rancho Los Cerritos, and I don't admittedly know a whole lot about it, but I know it was built in 1844, and it was owned by John Temple or Juan Temple, and that he took that Mexican name, he took Mexican citizenship, and he married a Mexican woman. So I think it probably falls into that third case study slot with Juan Bautista Rogers Cooper's house, and the very strong blending of both the Mexican and the American styles. So that kind of wraps it up as far as my reference to the vernacular significance. So the style, vernacular means of a time, of a place, of a people. And I think the very short period of significance that this style had and the very restricted geographic area it had, at least initially in Monterey, and the fact that it was so specific to this blending of two cultures, and that those two cultures reflected themselves in this specific style, but also in each individual building built in this style based on the backgrounds of its owners, was really made it a very outstanding example of vernacular architecture. So that's what I've got, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. And I should note that I think my thesis was discovered online by Megan, and she approached me about doing this talk. I don't think she actually had a copy of the full thing, but I am definitely happy to share a PDF of it with your group if you are interested in looking at it. Thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was absolutely fascinating. I did have one question, and then I'll see if anybody else does have questions. You mentioned the sala, like a ballroom, and our ballroom is upstairs. Was that typical or was that atypical?
I would say atypical. I mean, at least in the buildings that I've studied in Monterey, it was, the tradition was that, or it was typical that public spaces were downstairs and private spaces were upstairs. So it may be a little atypical, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. One of our volunteers suggested that that was an East Coast influence because they would have ballrooms upstairs.
Mm.
I forget why he said, but anyway.
Yeah, it's like, having a living room upstairs. It's a little awkward to invite your guests up the stairs to
Right,
socialize, but
well, they had a parlor downstairs, a small parlor,
Okay.
and then the ballroom upstairs that was, twice as big. Interesting, which we don't have it all anymore. But does anybody else have any questions? There was one question in the chat, but it was about our Adobe. Marcia was asking if we had the stone base like you mentioned the Monterey Colonials did, and I don't think we do. Is it your knowledge that we have a stone base? Because Alana?
My understanding was that we don't have a foundation.
Right, that's my understanding too. And there's a place where you can see the bottom of the wall in the back of the house where we have a growth chart where the family kept track of their heights, and you can see the bottom of the wall and you can see adobe bricks. So I think that ours does not.
Yeah, and that could be that Monterey is a very wet, damp environment compared to Southern California. So maybe it was something that was adapted to the very specific geographic location. I've heard it said that aside from keeping the water out of the walls, these chalk rock foundations might actually be the reason that a lot of adobe buildings fall in earthquakes. It's not the actual adobe that's so fragile, it's that they're sitting on these kind of friable foundations. So that was an interesting point I ran across. But
interesting, yes. So does anybody else have any other questions they'd like to put in the chat? I'm just curious, do you know about, obviously they're very prevalent in Monterey, and we have ours here. Do you have an idea of how many others there are in California, or pretty limited?
I think they're fairly rare. I know there's a big one that belonged to Vallejo and Petaluma. It's hard too because it was such a revival style for such a long period that it's hard to kind of determine sometimes what's original and what's not. But those that date to that early period before American control of California, I would say they're very rare, but I don't know exactly off the top of my head.
Good. Okay, we do have a question now. Was there common colors for the adobe homes?
Typically just a very light white. I think the plaster on the exterior used a lot of lime. It was typically just kind of the natural beigey white color. Sometimes they might paint it, but paint again was something you'd have to order from the East Coast, and so it was expensive and hard to get. I know the Larkin house has been kind of pink at one point, but that's been in later years and not very attractive in my opinion. I think it's more likely that if you did buy paint, it would be to use on things like woodwork on the interior, and you'll see like window trim set off in a different color. But the exterior walls are probably always just kind of a beige earth tone.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Oh, let's see. I see something in Q&A. Do we know if John Temple used lumber from Larkin's mill for the ceiling?
That would be a long way to ship the lumber.
I
don't know.
There was no lumber down here.
Okay.
So, yeah, we say that it did come from that area.
They definitely put lumber on ships too and sailed it up and down the coast. So it might not have been too hard to get it down there. But yeah, I think Larkin's operation in Santa Cruz was kind of the only thing for quite a while.
Yeah, it seems very likely that he probably did get it from him.
Mhm.
And one of our volunteers is noting that our roof was originally flat, we think.
Interesting.
And that it was hipped later.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering because yours is kind of U-shaped, correct? There's some like little low wings.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
There's
Was
one-
it converted later with the second story, or was it always like
no,
that?
it was
Okay.
originally 2 stories.
Hmm.
We think that the wings were only built halfway out the first dry season, and then they were extended the next dry season.
Okay. Interesting. A flat roof would be on a building that big would be a water risk.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, even modern buildings with flat roofs are, they have water problems. So.
Well, maybe it wasn't, and we thought it did. It was flat because the wings we know were flat. Yeah,
Okay.
because of the wings being flat.
Or maybe just a very shallow shed.
Right. Yes. No. All right. Was the gate color changed to blue, or was it always blue? Do you know that?
I know that it's been blue for many, many years. Like I would say way back. It's always been known as that. I don't know if it was originally blue or if it was even originally there, but it's known as the House of the Blue Door or Blue Gate because it's had a blue gate for a very long time.
Very long time. Okay. I think that is all. And thank you so much again, Caitlin. That was fascinating. We really enjoyed it, and it will be recorded. So people who aren't here tonight can see it later. Great. And you're welcome to drop off if you are not wanting to stay for the rest of our meeting. But thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. I have a small dog whining for dinner outside the door. Hopefully you didn't hear that the entire presentation.
I did not.
Okay, good. But I better go feed him. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your interest.
Yes, well, we appreciate your research, and that was fascinating. Thanks so much. I'll
be sure to pay Rancho Los Cerritos a visit next time I'm down south.
Say hi.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And now we have a short presentation by Sherry Ferris, and I believe Tom, I tried to promote him. Let's see if I try it again, if I can promote Tom to panelist. Uh-oh, he's being one of those that are, oh, no, there he goes. All right, so Tom and Sherry are going to make a brief presentation about the work that the DEIA Volunteer Committee has been doing. So thank you, Sherry, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can get us started, and then Tom and I can trade off. But we were asked actually to just share some information about what the DEIA working group has been doing. And that is a work group that was started earlier this year, and it has staff members and some volunteers on it. And as you may know from reading Quick Notes, the Rancho has been working on DEIA initiatives for a while at different levels, at the board level and staff level. And I think the idea behind this group was to get volunteers involved so that volunteer input could be shared on with really a focus on making the visitor experience of the Rancho part of the DEIA sort of focus. And the DEIA stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, as we know. And so this group is very organized, I must say. I'm very impressed with the leadership efforts of the group, because the group has really accomplished a lot and in a very organized way. And one of the first steps, I think, was to identify which of the DEIA themes should be the first priority, and accessibility was chosen. And so that covers like physical accessibility when visitors come to the rancho, but also accessibility through the website, and accessibility not just from physical, but also like age and different developmental stages of visitors. So some of the work has actually already been accomplished, and so many volunteers may have seen some of the touch items that are in some of the rooms where visitors can touch some of the items, and the mayordomo's room and the food storage room. Those items are in the windowsill areas, and then the blacksmith shop has some items. And the idea is to make the visitor experience of seeing the rooms more accessible by visitors being able to touch items, especially for younger visitors, but really everybody, because it sort of expands the experience of seeing what the rancho is about by being able to touch it, and also explore other senses as well. So another thing, I know, Laura, you prepared a list for docents about sounds that could be incorporated into the tours, like say when you're in the blacksmith shop and you're making the clanging sound of working with the metal. So I know that that's available. I can't quite remember where volunteers can find it, but I know it's available, and or it should, I think it is, I've seen it. But so that was created already. The touch items were put in place, and Tom did some great work in making the signage for that. So it's really been a collaborative effort. And then some of the projects that are ongoing and are still being worked on are creating some touch tables for visitors to be able to touch things from the different time periods, the cattle ranching period and the sheep ranching period, and then have activities to explore. So that's in process, which is really exciting to just sort of expand the way visitors can experience the rancho. And then one of the ongoing projects will be working on the website, and particularly the accessibility page. So that's sort of just an overview of some of the things that have been accomplished, the things that are in process. And I think the exciting part about it is just that it's expanding how the rancho can tell the stories that we tell, but also make that experience accessible for visitors at all levels, ages, and physical sort of stages of where they are. And I know there's more, but and so Tom, please share if I missed things, or I know you were involved with a lot of the graphic aspect that really looks nice.
Yeah, you summed it up really well. Mainly like the tables, the touch tables outside the rooms. There's going to be like for the cattle industry, there's going to be, I don't know if you can even see it, but we have like, that's not good. Oh, there it goes. You're going to, in the background, there's going to be a larger representation of the cattle industry from 1844 to 1866. Then there'll be behind the branding iron, there'll be different brands and how that associates with today's brands of, say, Nike or Apple. So people can understand that. Then there'll be another table, another sign behind the adobe showing how it's being built. You'll get to have a textures up in front of the different types of the hides, from the rawhide to the different processes and to the fur. And then on either side, there's going to be maybe braids, so people can actually learn how to braid a 3-braid and a 4-braid that they would use for making lassos. So it's, and then also a textural, there's a candle luminary, so that people can look inside it, they can touch it, they can feel the texture. So we're trying to get different senses, of touch and feelings of that era. And the same goes with the sheep too. There'll be, different types of, there'll be the, what the sheep herders might have looked like. Also the sheep shearers, that would be enlarged also on the table. They would go through the washing procedures, showing the irons, what they were like. People could pick those up. A lot of these things will be like the iron will have to be situated so you can't drop it and maybe break the anything. And things like, you know, the wool, how it's processed. There'll be little doors like that you can open up and answer a question to. So, you know, and also like you can see the candle, how that was being made in the tin, and then the old churner for making butter on the right-hand side. So it's going to be really interesting, and there are going to be nice tables that are made by our volunteer at the rancho, who's made many tables. So it's exciting, and it's all going little by little. And you know, like with the sound, one of the things that hopefully they'll get is a like going into the library. It'll be 1930s, and maybe there'll be maybe, you know, a baseball game going on from the Angels, or something like just old music, or the Fireside Chat by Roosevelt. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, and we also got new lighting in some of the rooms. You might have noticed it's a little bit brighter, so that helps us also. So I guess that's about it.
Thank you, Tom.
You're
Did I
welcome.
successfully share my screen? Did everybody see the touch tables? Oh,
Yes, thank you.
okay.
That worked out perfect.
Great. All right. So now we've come to the part of the evening when we promote everybody so that you can see and hear each other, hopefully. And so can you guess what I thought of for our conversation topic today with the architectural style of Monterey Colonial? The only thing I could think of is, what is your favorite architectural style? So I'll tell you mine, and then while you're thinking about what yours is, we will start promoting you to be panelists, and it'll be like you're leaving for a minute, but then you will show up and you'll be here. So my favorite architectural style is Victorian. I just love going to San Francisco and seeing all the painted ladies. And in fact, I lived in a painted lady in Long Beach when I was younger. It's a historic house. It was built in the 1890s. It's on Appleton Street, and it has a historic marker, and it was a really cool little place. It was originally built for farm workers to live in, and it originally did not have a kitchen. Luckily, by the time I lived in it, they had added a kitchen to my cute little Victorian house. So we're going to start promoting you now, and you can tell us what your favorite Victorian or favorite style of architecture is. Okay. iPad 2 and Joy Zadaka don't seem to be promotable.
We would still, if you have thoughts, you can still share them in the chat. And if you are, oh, we got one.
Yay. Okay, well, I see Charla has her hand up, so I'm going to pass it off to Charla and ask her to share. And then she'll pick the next person.
All righty. Can everybody hear me okay?
Mhm.
Oh, cool. My favorite architectural style, and I am not near as well versed as many of you, but I love craftsman homes. And I had the opportunity to rebuild my home a few years back, And given that opportunity, I changed it from a California bungalow, sort of Monterey style, but the veranda didn't go all the way around, to a airplane Craftsman, which is a 2-story Craftsman that has the 3-foot eaves that go all the way out on both the 2nd story and the 1st story. So when you look at it from the front, it looks like an airplane. That's how it got its name.
Okay, do you want to pick somebody to share with?
Nobody else has their hand raised that I
No,
see.
you pick. Okay.
Oh, Sherry. You're muted, Sherry.
There we go. Oh, because I love this topic so much that yes, I have to raise my hand. And I really can't pick because I like the Craftsman style as well. I just love that feel, but I love the style of the Rancho, especially the Spanish Mission Revival style, a little bit more than just a pure Monterey Colonial. Just feels so historical. And so, yeah, I guess I'd like to live in a house that looks like a Rancho with the adobe walls and the veranda and the courtyard. But so, yeah, does anyone else want to go? Or I'm going to pick Tom.
Okay. I love the Spanish Colonial. I live in a Spanish Colonial. It's 1929 and it has all the original hardware and all the original wall sconces and chandeliers, which are influenced by the Art Deco period. And I grew up in a Spanish Colonial as well. But I also love Victorian too. My family are all from San Francisco, and I was inundated with a lot of Victorian and grew up with Victorian furniture, the bedroom, parlor, and grew up with a Victorian grandma who set my politeness to the Victorian period. But so that's what I love. But I love all architecture. It's just amazing. So I'm going to hand off to, I think, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Actually, I can almost mimic what Sherry said. I am definitely Spanish Revival. Thrilled that I'm not where I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you never would have seen it, and here in Southern California. So I have, a one that's mimicked, that was built in the 90s, but I love the courtyards and just all of that, the balconies. So just, I'm with you, Sherry. That's my favorite. So I'm going to go to Alana.
So echoing some, I don't have anything unique yet. I also really love Victorian homes, and I will add Queen Anne Victorians. I really like the porches. But I did grow up like this house that I'm in right now is Mission Revival, so a lot of elements kind of match the Rancho, which is also really nice. And so kind of like Tom, there's a lot of the original like tile work in the kitchens and the bathrooms. So we have kind of like the upstairs bathroom at the Rancho, that mint with the like pops of yellow and the black and all of the geometric designs. Got one like that. We got a nice sort of pinkish purple one, and the kitchen's all yellow. So that has a special place in my heart too, but usually my go-to favorite would be the Victorian. I love how they look. And I will pass to Marsha.
Well, I'm into the Victorian, but I was building one today with my art teacher. So this is the type I like, with this porch, but now that I have trouble walking upstairs, but 2-story like that, inside, that kind of stuff. But I also like the what do you call, like the Bembridge house. So it's kind of Victorian, but it has a lot of other stuff. So I guess I like eclectic.
Bembridge is Queen Anne.
What?
Bembridge is Queen Anne.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I like a lot of things. So if I was going to build one, I would do an eclectic one. I would have different things. I love the house that the Bixby, what's his name? The one that's in Loma Linda. It's nearby the Rancho that I used to volunteer there all the time. He had our Rancho people come to him. I love that one. I like the one that's on the way there, and I think it's San Antonio, that White House that looks like something from, the White House time period. It's in Long Beach. But actually, anything except my house now. That would be it. Let's see. You said Linda was there, but I can't read. I don't hear her name anymore. Is she still there?
I think she has dropped off. I don't see her still here. You have Joyce and Martin and Nancy and Floyd and Kim.
Oh, well, then in that case, I have to pick Floyd and Nancy, since technically they're my old father and mother in our historical days. Go ahead. Are they there or no?
We'll see. She's still on mute. I think she's probably trying.
Okay.
But I'm sure that's Nancy's picture. That's Nancy, isn't it? All right, Nancy, can you do it?
There, I just found where the unmute is. Okay,
There you go.
actually, I can even go on video there.
There you are, both of you.
The background. Well, I like a lot of kinds of architecture, but I think Queen Anne Victorian would be my favorite. If I had to live in it, it would have to have modern bathrooms and modern kitchen. But other than that, it can be whatever else, because I think they're very pretty. In fact, I have a Queen Anne dollhouse in my living room. So I'm very fond of the Victorian. And I don't know about Floyd. Whether
I can put my two bits in. Yeah. How's that?
You can actually
Now,
see it.
When I was a very young child, I lived in an adobe house, very much like what you are in now. And I kind of like them.
Where was that?
El Paso, Texas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we had a small farm down in the Isleta part of El Paso, and my grandmother lived down there. Her husband, my grandfather, was a postman, but she had all sorts of stuff, and we lived in an adobe house.
Cool.
It's how the temperature is pretty steady.
And was it with the foundation or not? No, just kidding.
But I was maybe 5 years old, and so I didn't really address those things.
Well, I heard at the rancho that we always had the story that the reason why when we had the flat roof was that our I guess I would say you guys, but technically Fanny's mother used to complain that when it was hot, the tar would drip down onto the floor, so she made them do the pitched roof and all that. But I don't know if that's really true or not, but that's what it said in some biographies I read and some stories and things. So I don't know if that was true, but did you ever hear that story?
I can't say positively, but we did have a flat roof, and it was
Tar on top, a tar flat roof, or just
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because that's what they said when I went to help fix the adobe that time to rebuild it when we were fixing it, and that week we spent hot out there doing it. That's what the story was going around at that time. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
Of course, it doesn't rain a lot in El Paso.
Well, unfortunately, we can't say that now here.
Yeah.
so you want to pass it off to?
Oh, who else is there?
We have Joyce and Martin and Kim.
Kim, I'll pass it to you.
All right, I'm unmuted. I don't think, yeah, it's too dark. I'm going to turn the camera off. Does Sears Roebuck count?
That
that musty smell really gets me going.
That's a
No,
craftsman.
my grandparents had one of those. That's not my favorite style. Just brings back memories. I hate to be boring, but I too like the Queen Anne. Any Victorian will do. I love the gingerbread trims and the big porches and just everything about them. I would probably even sacrifice having a bathroom if I could live in one. I would be happy to go use the facilities outside. I don't know. Everywhere we travel, we always try to find if there's a Victorian section. We're very here in California anyway. We're very successful. The colors, just when you drive by them, it's like they're whispering stories to you. I mean, you drive through a neighborhood. I mean, Paso Robles, or I can't even think of the other ones, but even Monterey. I mean, they're just like whispering stories as you drive by. It's so cool. I love Victorian homes. And I guess that leaves Joyce and Martin.
And we'll see if we get to hear Joyce's Mickey Mouse voice.
Thanks.
No, it's the real Joyce voice.
All right. When I was younger, I liked Craftsman, but as I'm older, and I went on a tour of Cal State Long Beach with led by Sherry Ferris, who introduced me to Ed Killingsworth. And so I like the mid-century modern kind of clean lines and easy to maintain style now.
And I tend to be fond of the Craftsman style. I really like the green and green homes in the Pasadena area, although they tend to get a little dark inside, but they get very dark. But yeah, even the green and green home at the corner of Pacific and Country Club, I think is very pretty.
They are beautiful houses too. Okay.
Laura, what would be Sagamore, Theodore Roosevelt Sagamore home, in New York? What kind of style is that? Sagamore Hill, or the Roosevelt family lived?
Oh, we never went to it.
Federalist maybe, or Colonial. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's why I don't always know. I wish people would put like in their literature what the style is for the architecture of the places we visit or see. But I love that home.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I have recorded your time for being here, so you don't have to worry about doing that. Just a reminder, I think many of you are already signed up, but we have our Expanding Rancho Stories workshop Saturday morning at 10 to 12, which should be very interesting. And if you don't want to do that, we are open to the public, and I need tour guides for a special group too. So that's what's going on at the Rancho. And thanks for being volunteers, and thanks for being here tonight. And I'll let you get to your dinner because I'm ready to get to my dinner. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
So I can join.
Good night, everyone.
Stay well, everybody.
Night.
Yeah, how to get off.
I'm gonna end the meeting, so you'll all get booted. Thank you all for
Good,
joining
then I
us.
won't have to turn it off.
Night.